Hello. In this week's Parsha, we learn about Tzarat. And Tzarat is a skin malady that would result as a consequence for certain wrongdoings. And one of those is misuse of speech. And one of the measures in order to rectify the person who contracted Tzarat due to his misuse of speech was that he'd be forced into isolation. And this is not just a punitive measure for him having caused friction in the harmony of society by misusing his speech, and therefore he has to be isolated. But this is also a means to rectification. The person who misused his speech, he not only disrupted society, but he distanced himself from God, from himself, and obviously his fellow man. And if he wants to go back as a functioning, contributing member of society, he needs to be separated to really do the internal work to understand where his lacking is, what caused him to be the source of destruction. Because whenever somebody misuses their speech, it just causes all sorts of destructive occurrences. So he's set aside, and hopefully he does this internal work and he can go back as a functioning member of society. It's no coincidence that we discuss Tzarat in the same week. This week it happens to coincide with Parshat Hachodesh, where we have the commandment. We're told that Hachodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim, where we're supposed to sanctify the new month, and that we start with the month of Nisan. And also we learn about the Korban Pesach, because of course Nisan is the month that we have Pesach, where we had the redemption. And the redemption that took place from Egypt all started with the use of our voice. When we vayitzak, when we scream out to God, He heard us and began the redemption process. And we're told in Pesach to use our speech, to talk all about God being the source of our redemption and all the miracles He did. And we spend all night Pesach using our mouth to converse and talk about this redemption, about all the miracles that God did, about the whole thing. And it ties in really unbelievably, because the reason why, you have to think, God redeemed us from Egypt, but why were we there in the first place? And if we go back to the source of why we were in Mitzrayim in the first place, it all started with Yosef HaTzadik, who we're told he brought evil words back, an evil report about his brothers to his father. And when he used his speech in that way, and being this, as what we would call a tattletale, that started this hatred, and it snowballed when he continued to, what some people will call it, gloat about his dreams, which his brothers thought were these delusions of grandeur. And all that speech led to, or at least contributed to, the hate of the brothers to Yosef. And what happened to Yosef? He was forced into isolation because he was thrown into a pit where nobody was. Then, after that, he was in jail for a few years. And then, even when he was able to get out of jail, slowly taking the steps into society. He was a slave for Potiphar, so that's like the first step, but he was still isolated from his family. He didn't have a family, he didn't have any of that support system or anything. And in the first place, even though when he got down to Egypt and was made second to the king, he never forgot about this, and he always felt isolated. And we know this from the way he named his children. But he was not the only person who had to suffer in isolation. The brothers did their part in the sin too. They called him a dreamer. They mocked him. They used their speech to deceive their father Yaakov, and make him think that they were not accountable for Yosef gone missing. And so all this misuse of speech caused friction and divide, and in their own family. And that it was the steps that led them down to Egypt, which was sinat chinam, which is what we know as hatred for no reason. And the reason why it's hatred for no reason is because if we have faith and trust in God, then we take everything as it comes. We do the best that we can, and we do everything that we know to be right. We don't use our speech to destroy. We only use our speech. We're meant to use our speech to build people up, to build ourselves up, to build others around us up, to build up society. And anytime we don't, and we cause a friction in society, that is something that causes the galut, causes exile, physical, spiritual, emotional, all sorts of exile. And so they all had to suffer their isolation. The tribes also were thrown into jail by Yosef, and then of course when they became slaves, they were exiled too, all due to the misuse of speech. And it wasn't until Vayitzak, till we cried out to God, till we recognized that God is in control of everything, and that God is the one who can help us to set things straight and go in the right direction. And we called out to him. That was the beginning of the redemption. That's when Nisan starts. That's Hachodesh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim, when we begin the first month of counting. It was the first mitzvah that God gave, first commandment God gave to our nation, that was the first act that we would all do to unify us. It connected us all doing the same activities, sanctifying the new moon and sanctifying time because God commanded us, and knowing that we're going to live our lives now in a new way, in using our mouths when we do the Korban Pesach, which we're commanded at the same time, at the Seder, speaking all about God and understanding that God really runs the show, and that we should really just use our mouths, use our Pesach to talk about only things that are positive and will be helpful to us, to our families, to our society, and try and always use our words to bring people together. And I think that's really what this Shabbos is leading us into, understanding that the power of speech is so strong, and we should be careful, think twice before we speak, and make sure is this something that's helpful or harmful. And nowadays that message really needs to be put out there, so I hope that people will listen, and I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov.